Billionaire CEO ordered wine in Italian. Black waitress replied fluently, leaving him frozen. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into the story. The evening was set in one of the most exclusive restaurants in San Francisco, a place where the city's elite gathered to celebrate their wealth and influence. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of expensive wine, gourmet dishes, and the hum of high-profile business deals. At the center of it all sat Derek Caldwell, a tall, broad-shouldered man, the CEO of Valencer Biotech. His designer suit screamed power, and his blonde hair was slicked back with the confidence of a man who had everything. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the crowd as he exchanged pleasantries with colleagues, while his mind was already calculating his next move. A businessman at heart, Derek loved to be in control, always at the center of attention, always in charge. As he sat there, sipping on his expensive bourbon, he ordered a bottle of wine, casually mentioning that it should be a rare, expensive Italian red. He glanced over at the waitress standing by the table, her hands carefully balancing the tray of dishes she had just delivered. She was a young black woman, dressed in the simple black uniform that marked her as just another server in this opulent space. Her name was Naomi Brooks. She had worked at this high-end restaurant for months now, but despite her impeccable service, no one ever really noticed her. She was invisible to most of the guests, a quiet figure in the background. But Naomi wasn't bothered by the lack of recognition. She had learned to fade into the background, blending into the restaurant's luxurious ambience, allowing the spotlight to shine on the rich and powerful around her. But tonight, something was different. Derek's voice cut through the air as he asked the waitress to bring the wine in Italian, a language he assumed she couldn't understand. It wasn't just the request itself, but the way he said it, as if speaking to her in a foreign language would somehow elevate him, showing his superiority in a world that was always just out of reach for someone like her. Naomi didn't flinch. She had heard these types of comments before. The subtle arrogance, the assumption that she wasn't worthy of being treated with respect. But tonight, she would not be invisible. As she moved toward the table to deliver the wine, Naomi caught Derek's eye. Without hesitation, she smiled and replied, perfectly fluent in Italian, "I'll bring the wine right away, sir." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Derek froze, his hand still holding the glass of bourbon, his eyes wide in shock. The guests at the table exchanged confused glances, unsure of what had just happened. Naomi's words hung in the air, a simple, quiet declaration of the power she held, an unexpected mastery of a language he had assumed she could never speak. The silence that followed was thick, and for the first time that night, Naomi had everyone's attention. Derek's confidence faltered. He blinked a few times, then let out a nervous chuckle, but the damage was done. He had underestimated her, and now, it was clear he wasn't the one in control. Naomi moved swiftly, placing the wine on the table, never once breaking her composure. The guests watched her, their eyes following her every move, as if waiting for her to reveal some hidden truth. But all they saw was a woman who had defied their expectations. She didn't need to speak. Her presence, her calm response, had already done the work. Derek, still stunned, sat back in his chair, trying to regain his composure. His smile had faded, replaced by a look of disbelief. Naomi had just shown him that the game wasn't as one-sided as he thought. What Derek hadn't realized was that in this moment, it wasn't about who spoke the language, but who had the power to speak up and demand respect. And Naomi, in her quiet dignity, had done just that. The room was still. Naomi could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on her, every eye in the place trained on her, waiting for her next move. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, but it was the first time she had seen it unfold so clearly in front of her. Derek, the CEO who had looked at her as nothing more than a simple waitress, was now the one caught off guard. He had tried to use his power to belittle her, to make her feel small. But in this moment, it was clear he had misjudged her, and it was a mistake he would not forget. The other guests at the table shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. Some exchanged nervous glances, while others tried to hide their smiles. But one thing was certain, Naomi had their attention now. Derek took a deep breath, his face flushed with a mixture of surprise and irritation. He quickly masked his discomfort with a forced chuckle, but Naomi could see the cracks in his facade. He had always been the one in control, the one who set the tone, but now that power was slipping through his fingers. He had underestimated her, and that was something he could not fix with a laugh. Naomi, however, remained calm. She had been here before, in situations where people tried to reduce her to nothing. But she had learned over the years that the best way to respond was not with anger, but with quiet confidence. As she moved away from the table, she kept her head high, her movements steady, never acknowledging the discomfort she had just caused. The whispers started almost immediately. Naomi could hear the murmurs behind her, but she didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Derek, on the other hand, was still processing what had just happened. His eyes followed Naomi as she made her way back to the kitchen, his mind racing. She had responded so effortlessly, so naturally, as if speaking Italian was second nature to her. And for a brief moment, he wondered if there was more to her than he had first assumed. His thoughts were interrupted by a voice from across the table. Trent, his CFO, leaned in and whispered something to him, though Derek wasn't really listening. His attention was still on Naomi, and the realization was starting to settle in. She had just shattered the illusion of control he had built for himself. Back in the kitchen, Naomi took a moment to collect herself. She had done what she needed to do, show them that she was more than they thought, more than they had ever imagined. But even though she had proven herself in that moment, it wasn't about winning a battle. It was about making sure they knew she wasn't someone to be overlooked. Her manager, Foster, stepped into the kitchen, his face tense. He had witnessed the exchange from a distance, and Naomi could tell he was both impressed and a little nervous. "You did great," he said, his voice low, "but we need to be careful. You're going to draw attention, and you know how they can be." Naomi nodded, her expression unreadable. She wasn't worried about the attention. What she cared about was the message she had sent, not just to Derek, but to everyone who had ever doubted her. That night, Naomi proved something to herself. She had always known her worth, but now the people around her were starting to realize it too. It wasn't about being recognized for what she did. It was about standing her ground and showing that she would not be silenced. She had earned her place at that table, just as much as anyone else. Meanwhile, Derek sat back at his table, his mind still reeling. He couldn't shake the image of Naomi, standing there with such calm, speaking a language he had assumed she couldn't understand. He had seen her as just another waitress, a small part of the background in the opulent restaurant he frequented. But in that moment, she had become someone he couldn't ignore. He knew, deep down, that he would never look at her the same way again. And as much as he tried to shake it off, the feeling lingered, nagging at him. The rest of the night went by in a blur for Derek. His usual confidence had been replaced with an unsettling awareness. He had been put in his place, and it wasn't a feeling he was used to. The deal he had come to close with Naomi's employer no longer seemed as important as it had earlier in the evening. All he could think about was her quiet strength, the way she had responded to him without hesitation. She had left him frozen, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure who held the real power. The evening dragged on, but for Naomi, time seemed to move slower. She had returned to the kitchen, after serving the wine, but the weight of the interaction with Derek lingered. She wasn't one to seek attention, but this night had been different. As she wiped down the counter, her thoughts drifted back to the moment when she had spoken in Italian, effortlessly flipping the power dynamic. It wasn't about showing off, it was about asserting her place in a world that constantly tried to push her aside. Meanwhile, back at the table, Derek was struggling to maintain his usual bravado. The air around him had changed, his confidence faltering with each passing minute. The deal he had come to negotiate no longer seemed like the priority. His thoughts kept returning to Naomi, to the way she had calmly and confidently responded in a language he assumed she couldn't understand. His world, built on control and power, had just been upended by a quiet woman in a black uniform. As the evening wore on, Derek found himself glancing toward the kitchen more often than he'd like to admit. He had always prided himself on reading people, on understanding them before they even spoke. But Naomi had been different. There was something about her, her composure, her intelligence, her unshakable confidence, that threw him off balance. He couldn't understand it. He wasn't used to feeling this way, especially not after all these years of being at the top of his game. It wasn't just that she spoke Italian, it was how she did it. She wasn't just answering his question, she was showing him something he had never considered before, that intelligence and power weren't defined by appearance, by status, or by the surface-level assumptions people made. It was as if she had opened his eyes to a truth he had ignored for years. Back in the kitchen, Naomi was still processing the night's events. Foster, her manager, stepped in again, this time with a more serious look on his face. He had witnessed the entire exchange, and, despite his usual laid-back demeanor, couldn't ignore the tension in the air. "You did well out there, Naomi," he said, his voice low. "But don't get too comfortable. People like him." He gestured toward the dining area. "They don't like being shown up. They don't like being reminded that they're not in control." Naomi nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood the reality of working in a place like this. She had seen it time and time again. Rich, powerful people who believed they could treat others however they wanted. But what had happened tonight was different. Derek had assumed she was nothing more than a servant, a background figure in his high-powered world. And she had just proven him wrong. Naomi didn't need the accolades. She didn't need the praise. What mattered was that she had earned the respect of the room without asking for it. She had shown them all that she was more than they thought. Derek, on the other hand, had to face the uncomfortable truth that the power he wielded so effortlessly had been shaken by someone he had never even considered as a threat. As he sat back in his seat, his mind raced. His usual ability to dominate the room, to control every conversation, had been stripped away by a quiet waitress with a fluency in a language he had assumed she couldn't understand. He had never once looked at her as an equal, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. The night continued, but the mood had shifted. Naomi had unknowingly drawn a line in the sand, one that Derek couldn't easily cross back over. As the night came to an end, Derek stood up to leave, his thoughts still heavy with the events of the evening. He made his way toward the door, passing Naomi on the way out. For a moment, their eyes met. Naomi didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the impact she had made. She simply nodded, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But to Derek, that nod felt like a silent victory. He had underestimated her, and she had shown him just how wrong he was. As he walked out of the restaurant, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that this night had changed something in him. He had always believed that power was something you controlled. But now, he was starting to wonder if it wasn't just about control at all. Maybe power was about something else entirely, something Naomi had reminded him of in the most unexpected way. The next few days felt different for Naomi. The restaurant's usual hustle and bustle continued, but she couldn't shake the sense that everything had changed. Derek Caldwell's image lingered in her mind, but not in the way she expected. She wasn't angry, nor did she feel the need to seek revenge. Instead, she felt a strange sense of power, the kind that came from being seen for who she truly was, not just for her role. As she worked her shifts, Naomi noticed subtle changes in the way people looked at her. The guests who had once ignored her now regarded her with a new respect. There was a quiet acknowledgement in their gazes, an unspoken recognition of her worth. But the real change was in Derek. Naomi could see him coming and going from the restaurant over the next few days, often with his head held a little lower than before. He would glance at her occasionally, but it was different now. He was no longer the man who could command a room with a glance. Now, there was a certain wariness in his eyes when he saw her. It was as if the power he once had, the control he believed was his by right, had been questioned, and that made him uncomfortable. But Naomi didn't feel any desire for him to apologize. She wasn't looking for validation. What mattered was that she had stood her ground, that she had made her presence known in a way that no one, especially Derek, could ignore. One evening, as the restaurant was preparing to close, Naomi was cleaning up in the back when Foster, her manager, approached her. He had a curious look on his face, one that Naomi had seen before. It was the same expression he wore when he was about to reveal something unexpected. "You've got a visitor," he said, his voice low. Naomi paused, wiping down the counter. "Who?" she asked, not bothering to look up. "Derek," Foster replied. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "The CEO?" Foster nodded. "Yeah, he's asking for you." For a moment, Naomi didn't know what to make of it. Derek had never shown any interest in her beyond the surface-level interactions typical of a restaurant employee and customer. And yet, here he was, asking for her specifically. She wasn't sure whether to be curious or cautious. "Okay," she said, setting down her cloth. "I'll go see what he wants." When Naomi entered the front of the restaurant, she found Derek standing near the bar, looking a little out of place. He was still dressed in his usual sharp suit, but there was something about him now, something that seemed less certain, less confident. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of hesitation and resolve. "Naomi," he began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. I wanted to apologize." Naomi crossed her arms, waiting for him to continue. "I've been in the business world for a long time," he said, "and I've always prided myself on knowing people, knowing what they can do, what they're capable of. But when I saw you that night, when you spoke to me in Italian, I realized I was wrong about you. About a lot of things, actually. I misjudged you." Naomi felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but she kept her expression neutral. "You didn't misjudge me, Derek," she said, her voice steady. "You just didn't bother to look beyond what you thought you knew. And that's on you." Derek's face flushed with embarrassment, but there was no defensiveness in his eyes. Instead, he nodded slowly. "You're right. I've been too caught up in my own world, too used to looking down at people like you." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "People like me?" she asked. "You mean people who work for a living, who do their jobs well, but never get the recognition they deserve?" Derek shifted uncomfortably, his hands in his pockets. "Yeah, I guess so. I've taken a lot for granted. I've treated people like they were invisible. And that's not okay." There was a pause as Naomi processed his words. She wasn't sure if she should believe him, if this was just another attempt to get back to business as usual. But there was something in his eyes now, something genuine. "I'm sorry," he said again, this time with more sincerity. "I've been an arrogant jerk. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I just wanted to tell you that." Naomi nodded slowly, absorbing his apology. "Apology accepted," she said, her tone calm but firm. "But just remember this. Respect isn't given because you ask for it. It's earned." Derek looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Finally, he spoke again. "I get it," he said quietly, "and I'll work to earn it." Naomi turned to leave, but before she could take a step, she paused and glanced back at him. "You know," she said, "the next time you're looking for someone to impress, maybe look a little closer. You might be surprised by what you find." Derek didn't say anything, but he watched her walk away, and in that moment, Naomi knew that things had changed. Not just for her, but for him too. A few weeks passed since that memorable evening at the restaurant, and life for Naomi had mostly returned to its usual pace. She continued her shifts, serving drinks, delivering meals, and managing the usual demands of the job. But everything felt different now. She could tell that the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. It wasn't just because of the way Derek had treated her after that night, or the way her colleagues looked at her with a newfound respect. It was something deeper, a sense of recognition that had always been absent before. Naomi was no longer just another waitress. She had become someone who had earned her place in the room, someone who was noticed, even if she didn't seek the spotlight. The change didn't go unnoticed by Derek either. He had continued to visit the restaurant regularly, though he never sat at Naomi's section. His interactions with her had been cordial, respectful even, but there was an unspoken tension between them, one that neither of them could deny. He had made it a point to stop by the kitchen to speak with her on several occasions, though those conversations remained short, businesslike. Yet, Naomi could feel that his demeanor was different now. It was as though the arrogance he once exuded had been tempered by something. Humility, perhaps, or a growing awareness of the world outside of his own bubble. One evening, just as Naomi was preparing to leave her shift, she found herself face to face with Derek once again. This time, he was standing near the exit, waiting for her. Naomi felt a slight hesitation in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She wasn't about to be intimidated. "Naomi," Derek said, his voice a little more subdued than usual, "I need to talk to you." She nodded, not saying anything, but her eyes met his, expectantly. "Look, I know things have been awkward between us," he continued, taking a step closer. "And I've been thinking about how I've treated you, and how I treated others in general. Honestly, I don't know what it is, but something's changed in me since that night." Naomi raised an eyebrow, her arms folded across her. chest. Is that so? She asked, her voice steady. Derek ran a hand through his hair, looking more vulnerable than she had ever seen him before. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I realize now how wrong I was. Not just with you, but with a lot of the people I've worked with, and I've made some bad calls, too. Naomi was quiet for a moment, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, and though it wasn't an apology she expected, it was close enough. I guess the question is, she said slowly, why now? Why after all this time? Derek hesitated, looking at her with a mix of regret and newfound awareness. Because you made me see something I didn't want to. You didn't just speak Italian to me that night. You spoke to something inside me that I thought I'd buried. You made me confront the truth I've been avoiding for years. And for that, I owe you an apology, Naomi. Naomi felt a brief flicker of surprise, but it quickly faded. She had seen enough in her life to know that apologies weren't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, they came in quiet, unexpected moments. I appreciate that, she said, her voice calm. But you don't need to apologize to me. You need to apologize to the people who've always been there for you. Your team, your employees, the ones you've overlooked. They're the ones who deserve to hear it, not me. Derek nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I'm working on that, he said, taking a deep breath. I've already started making changes. I've been talking to the people who've worked for me for years, and I'm trying to do better. But I needed to start with you. Naomi didn't say anything for a moment, considering his words. She had always believed that true growth came from within, and if Derek was really changing, then that would speak louder than anything else. I hope you mean it, she said finally. Because it's one thing to say you're going to change, and it's another to actually do it. Derek's smile grew a little wider. I know, and I will. With that, he turned to leave. But before he could walk away, he paused and looked back at her. Naomi, thank you. For showing me that I'm not always right. For reminding me that there's more to life than control and power. Naomi nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. Just don't forget that lesson. For your sake and for everyone else's. As Derek left, Naomi stood there for a moment, watching him walk out of the restaurant. She had no idea what the future held for him, or for herself. But for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace with where she stood. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone who had made a difference, someone who had been heard. And that, she knew, was more powerful than anything Derek Caldwell could offer her. It had been a month since Derek's apology, and Naomi could sense that things were different. The restaurant, once just a place she worked to make ends meet, now felt more like a stage where she had found her voice. She had become a quiet force, respected not because of her position but because of her presence. Derek continued to visit, but their interactions had become more civil, more genuine. She no longer saw him as the arrogant CEO who once belittled her. Instead, he was someone she observed from a distance, someone who, for the first time in a long while, seemed unsure of himself. He still carried the air of a powerful man, but Naomi could tell that the power had shifted, subtly and irrevocably. One evening, as Naomi was wiping down the counter near the kitchen, she noticed Derek at the bar, speaking to a group of his colleagues. He caught her gaze from across the room and, without missing a beat, stood up and walked over. Naomi didn't flinch, but she felt the familiar tension rise in her chest. This time, however, it was different. There was no sense of superiority in his steps, no air of intimidation in his approach. It was almost as if he was coming to her as an equal. Naomi, Derek said, his voice warm yet respectful. Can I have a word? Naomi set the cloth down and looked at him. She could see the sincerity in his eyes. Sure, what's up? She replied, trying to keep her tone neutral. I wanted to thank you, he said, his hands slightly trembling. Naomi raised an eyebrow, her arms crossed. Thank me for what? She asked, her voice steady. For making me realize something important, Derek replied. I've spent so much time in my own bubble, focusing on control, on power, that I forgot what truly matters. You've taught me more than I ever expected. Naomi looked at him, still unsure where this conversation was headed. I'm not sure I follow, she said, her voice still measured. You've taught me that power isn't always about being the loudest voice in the room, Derek explained, his gaze dropping for a moment before looking back at her. It's about having the humility to listen, to understand. You made me see that I've been blind to the people who truly matter. Like you, Naomi. You're the ones who make everything work, and I've been taking that for granted. Naomi's expression softened slightly, but she didn't let go of her skepticism. You've said a lot, but I'm still waiting for the proof, she said, her arms uncrossing as she leaned against the counter. I'm working on it, Derek said, nodding. I've started making changes in the company. I've had meetings with my staff, with the people who have been here for years. I've been listening more, and I plan to do more, not just for them, but for the people who work under me, like you. I've realized that respect is something that needs to be earned, not demanded. Naomi studied him carefully. She had heard similar words before, from people who had quickly reverted to their old ways. But there was something different in Derek's demeanor. He wasn't trying to win her over with grand gestures or promises he couldn't keep. He was simply acknowledging the truth. I'm glad to hear that, Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. But it's not just about words. It's about your actions. The people who work for you need to see that change, not just hear it. Derek nodded, looking determined. I understand that. And I'm going to prove it. It's going to take time, but I'm committed. Naomi gave him a small, appreciative nod. She had never expected anything from him, but hearing his words, sincere, without the usual bravado, felt like a small victory in itself. All right, Naomi said, offering him a faint smile. I'll believe it when I see it. Derek smiled back, a genuine smile that seemed to come from a place of true understanding. I'll make sure you do, he said. As Derek turned to walk back to his table, Naomi stood there for a moment, watching him. She had no idea what the future held for him or for her, but she knew one thing. The world had shifted, and it was no longer about who held the most power. It was about who had the courage to acknowledge their mistakes and make things right. Naomi had proven that one person, no matter their position, could change the dynamics of a room, and she had done so without ever raising her voice. It had been weeks since Derek's apology, and Naomi could feel the shift in the air. The tension that had once clouded the space between them was slowly dissolving, but the path ahead was still uncertain. Derek had kept his word, making efforts to follow through on his promises. The restaurant's staff, who had witnessed his change in attitude, had started to notice the difference. His visits became more frequent, but they weren't about business deals anymore. He began taking the time to speak to Naomi, not as a superior, but as someone trying to make amends. There were still moments of awkwardness, but Naomi had learned not to expect perfection. She had been where he was, someone who thought that power and control defined everything. But now she understood that true change wasn't about grand gestures. It was about consistency, and over time, Derek had shown he was trying. One quiet afternoon, Naomi stood by the counter in the kitchen, cleaning dishes as the slow hum of the restaurant buzzed in the background. Foster, her manager, walked in, a slightly mischievous look on his face. You won't believe who's here, he said, pausing in the doorway. Naomi didn't turn around. Who? She asked, her voice even, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. Derek, Foster replied, letting out a small laugh. I think he's starting to feel like he owns the place now. He wants to talk to you again. Naomi couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the first time he had come by to speak with her, but the way Foster said it made her feel like a change had truly taken root. I'll be out in a second, she said, setting down the dish she had been washing. She walked into the main dining area, where Derek was sitting at a table by the window. He was alone, his usual entourage of business associates absent. His posture was relaxed, the usual tightness in his shoulders gone. When Naomi approached, he stood up quickly, as if eager to engage with her, but there was no air of superiority this time. He seemed like a man who had left that part of his life behind. Naomi, he said, offering a warm smile. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. Naomi nodded, keeping her demeanor neutral, though she couldn't help but feel a hint of curiosity. Not at all, she said, pulling out the chair across from him. What's on your mind? Derek leaned back in his seat, his expression more thoughtful than usual. I just wanted to thank you again, he began, his voice low. For everything. For challenging me to see things differently, for helping me realize how much I've overlooked. Naomi didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, waiting for him to continue. Derek let out a sigh, clearly grappling with his own thoughts. You were right. I've spent years thinking that success meant always being on top, that power meant control. But it doesn't. It's about understanding, about listening to the people around you. It's about being a part of something bigger than yourself. Naomi nodded, her arms crossed. That's what I've been trying to tell you, she said simply. Derek paused, his eyes meeting hers. I know, and I've been trying to live by that. It's been hard, but I'm getting there. Naomi studied him for a moment. I'm glad you're making the effort, Derek. But remember, it's not just about what you say. It's about how you treat people. People can see through the words if they're not backed up by action. Derek's gaze softened. I know. That's why I'm here. I want you to see that I'm committed to this, to being better. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. It's a long road. But if you really want to change, then prove it. To the people you've worked with, to the ones who are still counting on you. He nodded, his expression determined. I will. I've already started with the team. I've been giving them more responsibility, listening to their ideas, trying to give them the respect they deserve. Naomi could see the sincerity in his eyes, and for the first time, she believed that he might just follow through. Good, she said, her voice steady. I'll be watching, Derek. The people around you will be watching too. It's not about making up for the past. It's about showing up every day and doing better. Derek smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I know, and I will. As they sat there in silence for a moment, Naomi couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had always known that true change came from within, that the most powerful shifts happened when people confronted their own weaknesses. Derek had done that, and in the process, he had earned something more valuable than any deal or power move could ever give him: respect. He had earned Naomi's respect, and that was something money couldn't buy. When Derek stood up to leave, he gave her one last look, a look of quiet gratitude. Thank you, Naomi, he said softly. She nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. Just keep doing better, she replied. As he walked out of the restaurant, Naomi stood by the counter, watching him go. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew this. The world had a way of shifting when you least expected it. And sometimes, all it took was one person to make a difference. It had been a few weeks since Derek had made his commitment to change, and Naomi was starting to see the small shifts in his behavior that spoke volumes. The restaurant's dynamic had subtly changed too. The staff had noticed the difference in Derek's interactions. He no longer spoke down to them, no longer expected things to be done with a snap of his fingers. There was a new respect in the way he carried himself, in the way he greeted them when he arrived at the restaurant. And while Naomi remained cautious, she couldn't help but appreciate the effort he was making. She had seen his humility in the way he treated the team, the way he took time to listen, and the way he acknowledged their contributions. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, after a busy dinner rush, Naomi was clearing up the counter in the back of the restaurant when she heard the familiar sound of the front door opening. She looked up to see Derek walking in, as usual, dressed in his sharp suit. But there was something different in the way he looked at her now. He wasn't the arrogant CEO who once ruled the room. He was someone who had changed, slowly but surely. Naomi, he said, his voice calm, no longer the loud, authoritative tone he used to have. Do you have a moment? She gave him a look, wiping her hands on her apron before nodding. Sure, what's going on? Derek took a step closer, a slight smile on his face, though there was a hint of hesitation in his expression. I just wanted to thank you again for helping me realize a lot about myself. It's been a process, but I'm getting there. Naomi tilted her head, crossing her arms as she studied him. I've seen the change, she said, but actions speak louder than words, Derek. I'm still waiting to see if this is more than just talk. Derek nodded, understanding the skepticism in her voice. I get that, and I've been trying to make it more than just words. He paused, glancing around the restaurant. I actually wanted to ask you something. Naomi raised an eyebrow. Go ahead. Would you consider helping me with something? He asked, his tone softer now. I've been thinking about some changes I want to make to the restaurant, how we operate, how we treat each other. But I think I need someone who's seen both sides, someone who knows what it's like to be on the other end, to help me get it right. Naomi took a deep breath, weighing his words. She had never expected Derek to come to her for advice. She had always seen herself as just another waitress, never imagining that she would be the one someone like Derek would turn to for guidance. But then again, she realized that was part of the change. Derek had stopped seeing her as just a server. He had begun to understand that she had something valuable to offer, something he had overlooked before. "I don't know if I'm the right person for the job," she said slowly. "But if you're serious about making those changes, I'll help. It's going to take more than a few shifts in behavior, though. It's going to take a complete shift in mindset." Derek's eyes lit up. "I'm ready for that. And I'm ready to work with you, Naomi. I know it's not going to be easy, but I think it's the right thing to do." Naomi smiled, a genuine smile that came from the realization that Derek wasn't just paying lip service anymore. He was putting in the effort, and he was seeking out guidance from the people who had always been a part of his world, just in the background. "All right then," she said. "Let's get to work." Over the next few weeks, Naomi worked closely with Derek, helping him navigate the changes he wanted to make. They started by revising the restaurant's staff policies, making sure that everyone felt heard and valued. Derek spent more time with the team, learning their names, learning about their lives outside of work, and making sure they knew that they mattered. It wasn't perfect, but the difference was undeniable. The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted. The staff felt more like a family, and Derek had become a more grounded, empathetic leader. But it wasn't just about the staff. Derek had begun to carry the lessons he learned from Naomi outside the restaurant as well. He had taken the time to meet with other business leaders, to listen to the people he had once brushed aside, and to offer help where he could. The shift in his attitude was evident, and it was clear that the change wasn't just temporary. It had become a part of who he was. One evening, as Naomi was closing up the restaurant, Derek approached her again. He was smiling, but there was something different in the way he spoke this time. "Naomi," he said, his voice sincere, "I just wanted to thank you again. You've changed my life. You've helped me become someone I'm proud of." Naomi felt a warmth spread through her chest, but she didn't let it show. "I didn't change you, Derek," she replied. "You changed yourself. I just helped you see what was already inside you." Derek smiled, nodding. "Either way, I'll never forget it." Naomi watched him leave, and as the door closed behind him, she realized that the world had shifted once again. This time, it wasn't just her world. It was his too. Months passed, and the once overlooked dynamics of the restaurant had changed beyond recognition. Naomi had seen the shift in Derek, and she had seen it in the people around her. The staff had begun to flourish under his leadership, empowered by the respect he now showed them. The atmosphere had lightened, and with that, the restaurant became more than just a place to eat. It became a space where everyone mattered. Naomi, however, was still a quiet observer, not one to seek praise or accolades. She had done what she set out to do, and now the effects of her actions were clear to everyone around her. Derek had truly changed, and she had been a part of that change. But Naomi's impact went beyond just Derek or the restaurant. It rippled outward, as small acts of kindness often do, touching people in ways she would never fully know. One afternoon, she received a letter in the mail. It wasn't the kind of letter she was used to, a corporate memo or a bill. No, this one was personal. It was from Derek. It read, "Naomi, I wanted to take a moment to formally thank you, not just for your help with the changes at the restaurant, but for the way you've opened my eyes. You've reminded me that leadership isn't about dominance or control. It's about respect, humility, and recognizing the worth in others. I've learned a great deal from you, and I will carry these lessons with me always. Thank you for being the person you are, and for showing me what true leadership looks like." Naomi sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the letter in her hands. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't needed this. But in some quiet corner of her heart, she felt a warmth spread. It was one thing to see change in someone else. It was another to be acknowledged for your role in that transformation. As the days went by, Naomi kept her head down, focused on her work and her life outside the restaurant. She had never been someone to seek the spotlight. She had always been content to stay in the background, letting others take the credit. But something had shifted in her too. For the first time, she felt a quiet sense of pride, not just in the work she had done, but in the person she had become. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was someone who had helped shape a future, not just for herself, but for those around her. One evening, as Naomi was locking up the restaurant after a particularly busy shift, Derek came in, just as he had many times before. But this time, there was something different in the air. He wasn't just stopping by to check in. He had a look of determination on his face, and Naomi couldn't help but notice it. "Naomi," he said, as he approached her, his voice steady. "I've been thinking a lot about everything we've worked on together. and I've come to a decision. I want you to be part of something bigger. I'd like to offer you a position, a real position, not just as a server, but as someone who helps shape the future of this place. Naomi blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected this. Not from Derek, not from anyone. She had never asked for a promotion, never expected to be seen as anything other than what she had always been. I don't know what to say, Naomi replied, her voice soft. You don't have to say anything right now, Derek said, his tone sincere. Just know that the offer is there. I want you to be part of this. I want to see where we can go from here, together. Naomi took a deep breath, processing his words. It was a moment she never could have imagined, not even a few months ago when she first stepped foot into the restaurant. Just another waitress in the background of the lives of the people around her. But now, things were different. She had earned her place in this world, and it wasn't by accident. It had been earned through patience, through dignity, and through the quiet strength that had always been there, even when no one else saw it. She looked up at Derek, meeting his gaze. All right, she said, her voice steady. I'll do it. But let's make sure we do it right. Derek smiled, and for the first time, Naomi felt that she was truly seen. She wasn't just another person passing through his life. She had become someone who mattered. And that, she knew, was the real victory. As she walked out of the restaurant that night, Naomi felt a sense of contentment wash over her. It wasn't about the position, the recognition, or the accolades. It was about knowing that she had made a difference, and that the world around her was just a little bit better because of it. She had shown Derek that power wasn't something you took, it was something you earned. And in doing so, she had earned something more valuable than any promotion or title could offer: respect.